Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Black Keys with the Lengths. And before I get started on this week's topic, I want to remind you all that we have launched a crowdfunder campaign, and it's going to be running throughout the month of November. And this is because we're trying to raise money to replace our transmitter, which is quite old now and is on its last legs, and we want to try to replace it before it kind of finally fails us right in the middle of a really great show, leaving all of you guys without something to listen to. And another reason that we're interested in doing this right now is that we have been on the air for 5 years. We've not had a single break within that time. We've just had our license extended by Ofcom. We've got another 5 years at least. And so it's a really great time to kind of look back and celebrate what we have done, look forward to what we're going to do, and think about what we need to accomplish that. And the transmitter is a big part of that. So hopefully you like all of our shows, you tune into a lot of them, you want to keep tuning into them. So if you do, if that's you, then please consider logging on to the crowdfunder.co.uk website or visiting our website, which has a link to the crowdfunder area where we're running our campaign. And please try to give us a little bit of extra money if you've got some. If you've already given us a little something, thanks very much for that. Maybe you might think about visiting again, especially towards the end of the month, giving us a bit more if we haven't quite reached our goal, because we are still a little bit short. And if you haven't given anything yet, then if you have anything to spare this month, even if it's just a $5, that would be really useful. So that's enough of that for me. I don't want to spend too much time begging. I want to launch right into the science. And this week we are going to be talking about human pregnancy again. And if you were listening a couple of weeks ago when I started this two-part series, I did a lot of talking about pregnancy kind of from the perspective of the baby, and talking about the development of the baby and what happens as it goes from being an embryo to being an infant and then being born. And this week I want to think about more of the kind of stuff that affects the mother, and thinking about some of the other broader issues associated with pregnancies. And in this case, I actually have found a lot of recent studies that are quite interesting, with some new developments in our understanding of pregnancy. And so that's what this is going to kind of be like this week, is rather than kind of talking about more general things, I'll discuss each of these studies that I have located. And the first of these is a very recent bit of research on the natural variation that we find in the length of human pregnancies. And you might remember, if you were listening before, that I said that we tend to calculate human pregnancies as 280 days after the onset of the last menstrual period. So it doesn't actually begin with conception, it begins with that last change in hormones in the mom. And what's interesting about that is that even though we tend to think of these delivery dates, these due dates, as being quite a useful marker, actually we find that only about 4% of women deliver on that date, and only about 70% deliver within 10 days of that date. So that leaves about 30% of women out there that are kind of falling way all over the place in terms of the calendar and when they're giving birth. So clearly our methodology is not very reliable, and it's not very specific, and it would be quite useful to have something more specific, because we could understand a lot about pregnancy if we could assign exact ages and exact developmental stages a bit more specifically. We can make better predictions when we're trying to take care of mothers and think about what we need to do at what point. And so researchers were interested in finding a way to kind of move away from ultrasounds and think about using maybe something that's a bit more precise. And that's why they've turned to looking at hormones. And what they've done is selected a group of women in whom they could collect urine samples on a daily basis, so that they could look at hormones within that urine and very precisely assess whether or not these women are pregnant, and then kind of look as they go on through their pregnancy to see other hormonal changes, and once they know exactly how far along they are kind of follow them through to the due date and see how long it took them to get there. And what was quite nice is that they were able to select 125 women, and these women were in different stages of pregnancy, so they had a group in the first trimester, a group in the second, and a group in the third. And the women that were in the first trimester, they were also able to follow those guys all the way through the pregnancy. So they kind of had two different tacks here. They were able to compare those three groups in terms of how their hormones differed from one another, and then they were also able to look at that one first group and follow them all the way through in order to get a longitudinal view of the whole pregnancy process. And the three hormones that they were interested in were human chorionic gonadotropin, estrone 3 glucuronide, and pregnanediol 3 glucuronide. And there's going to be a quiz on that at the end of the show. I hope you remember all three of those very specifically. And the reason that these things are interesting is that they are all indications that an embryo is present. So as soon as these things pop up in a woman's urine, they know for sure that she has become pregnant. And this can happen much more quickly than the signal that you would get if you were waiting in order to do a pregnancy test. So this is something that's a very immediate, very good, reliable sign of pregnancy. Another thing they could do is look at estrogen and progesterone, and that was something that would allow them to figure out whether ovulation has occurred. So even if a woman wasn't yet pregnant, they could tell whether she had secreted the egg from the ovary and was in a state to maybe be receptive to becoming pregnant. And on average, they found that the length of time from ovulation to birth was 268 days, and this is 38 weeks and 2 days. And if you were listening to last week's show, you might remember, or a couple weeks ago, sorry, that a baby is considered to be, ready for birth at about 37 weeks. And so 38 weeks and 2 days is obviously quite a bit longer than that. So it seems that actually on average, babies need a bit longer than we kind of were initially thinking. And the other thing the researchers noted was that there was natural variation of about 37 days. So just naturally from one woman to the next, there might be a difference of a whole month in terms of how long they need to gestate their baby before the baby's ready to be born. And this is all even after the researchers had already excluded for data that involved preterm births and exposure to chemicals and other situations that might shorten the pregnancy. So this is purely natural variation of about a month. And the researchers found relationships between hormone variation and length to implantation, also between hormones and time between implantation and delivery. So clearly all these fluctuations are related to lots of different things associated with pregnancy and can therefore be used to predict how long it's going to take for certain things to happen, and if women are at one stage, how long can they expect until they reach that next stage. And what all of this tends to suggest is that events that are happening quite early in pregnancy can actually have long-lasting effects on the mother. So the fact that they're able to see these things really, really early on in those urine samples and then have these patterns that are very consistently tied to that suggests that something quite early on is setting the stage for how the mother is going to be gestating the young and what the whole pregnancy is going to be like. And this can potentially explain some patterns that have previously been very confusing to scientists. So things that they've seen in pregnancies and not really understood why this happens in one woman and not another. And maybe it is these early pregnancy things that are kind of setting the whole stage. Other characteristics that were found to influence the duration of pregnancy included the age of the mother. So older women tended to have a longer gestation period. So basically every extra year in the mother's age was associated with about an extra day of gestation needed for the infant. Also the birth weight of the mother. So the heavier a mother was at birth, the more likely it was for her to have a longer gestation. And again, there's quite a good ratio here where you've got every 100 grams of the mother's birth weight was associated with about an extra day in terms of gestation. And also, if a woman has previously had a lengthy pregnancy, she's likely to have a lengthy pregnancy again in the future. And especially these last couple of things suggest that there might be quite a genetic influence here. So if you've had someone ever say, well, your mom was quite a large baby and you were a large baby, so obviously this runs in the family. Well, there may actually be a lot to say about that. There might be these characteristics are passed down from one generation to the next, and the same with lengthy pregnancies as well. So actually, if you are expecting to get pregnant or to be pregnant with a partner, then you can kind of look at what's happened in your own family history and maybe predict about what's going to happen whenever you go to start your own family. So anyway, the upshot of all this research is that the researchers, first of all, say this could be a really important first step in better understanding pregnancies and getting more details about pregnancies, because we can now be more precise and look at these patterns in a new way now that we can really strictly assign ages and developmental stages rather than kind of generalizing. But also, it's really important when you think about these decisions that are made kind of towards the end of a pregnancy, when people are debating whether or not they should induce birth, whether they should start to get worried because they've been gestating for too long. So now we actually can say, well, maybe this does seem like quite a long time to you, but we tend to have all of this variation. We know that, we do normally have this 268-day period, but some women go on for an average of 37 days beyond that, if not more. So we actually can get a better idea how far out of the norm a particular pregnancy is or not, and that will be quite useful in deciding what to do next in terms of medically addressing a long pregnancy. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Tift Merritt with All the Reasons We Don't Have to Fight. And I've picked that song, which doesn't necessarily sound like a pregnancy song, because the next study I want to talk about is one that looks at genetic conflicts in human pregnancy. This is quite interesting because a lot of people tend to think that pregnancy is a cooperative interaction between a mother and a fetus, and it's all rainbows and sunshine and happiness. But of course, we know that pregnancy can be really rough. A lot of mothers will be quite morning sick, and they'll be tired all of the time. And these are just a couple of the ways that you can see that there is a bit of a tension here between the pregnant woman and her developing fetus. And a lot of that is derived from the fact that the fetus is going to want the mother to give as much as she possibly can, because it's trying to maximize its own survivorship and its own health. And I say this as though it's calculating, and of course we know that fetuses aren't calculating, but they do have these genes within them that evolutionarily drive them to kind of try to get these things out of the mom. But the mom, of course, while she wants to make sure that her fetus is as healthy as possible, she does also need to preserve some energy for herself, for now, and also some energy for the future offspring that she might want to have later on. And so this, again, is going to be this kind of genetic thing where she's going to feel this drive, and her body's going to do certain things to ensure that she's doing as much as she can for this fetus, but also maintaining herself in good enough shape that she can have a reproductive future as well. And all of this is, as I mentioned earlier, driven by these genes that each of these individuals will carry. And of course the mom and the baby will share some genes, but the baby will also have some genes from the father. And that's particularly where you can get these things kind of causing some tension, is because the genes from the father aren't going to be quite as friendly to the mother's genes. And so they might want something more out of that mother than that mother can give. And so there is this really interesting tension between all the genetic material. And this rises kind of from the fact that the successful genes within a fetus are the ones that are able to get the fetus more nutrients out of the mother, so balancing the need to kind of take a bunch of nutrients now but not overtax the mother to the point that she's not able to give some later. So these are genes that are able to get the baby what it needs and make sure that it can keep getting what it needs for as long as it needs them. But then you've got these successful maternal genes that are the ones that are able to kind of put some limits on that and make sure that it reaches an optimum for the baby and also the kind of the future babies as well, so this kind of reproductive future that I mentioned, but not going in excess of that. So you're balancing the input into the current and the future reproduction. And this dichotomy between what these two sets of genes are going to want creates this kind of arms race or an evolutionary escalation, so that you might have some fetal actions that are going to be opposed by maternal countermeasures, and then this process will keep going. So it's going to be this perpetual kind of fight to get to the top of this and to win out. And that's happening even within individual cells within a fetus, where you're going to have these mixtures of genes. So as I said earlier, you've got some genes from the mom and some genes from the father. And where you have this tension is the fact that, maternal genes within a fetus are going to be kind of friendly, if you like, towards the mom. But when you've got those ones from the father, those can be more selfish because they don't really care if the maternal genes are surviving. What they want are for the paternal genes to survive. They're out for their own good. And these two things can be distinguished from each other because really early on, we have something called genomic imprinting, where there are these little tags, these little changes that happen whether it's a little bit of an atom added here or a chemical added there, or whatever is happening, there are these little physical distinctions between the DNA of the mom and the DNA of the dad, and so they can kind of tell each other apart, and they're going to act differently, and this is going to cause this kind of battle between the two. And so this is what creates all of this conflict, both within those cells within the fetus and between the overall fetus and the mother. And it sounds crazy that all of this could be going on, but this is the work of evolution that's going to favor these things that are able to battle it out and get what they can. And so this is how you have this constant escalation of the characteristics between the infant and the mother. And one of the big battles centers around implantation. So you've got these fetally derived cells called the trophoblasts, and they're invading the maternal endometrium. So I talked about this a couple weeks ago. You've got the blastocyst coming through as it's developing, as all these cells are dividing and adding onto themselves and becoming more and more of a fetus-like thing and not just that original fertilized egg. And they come into the uterus, and then they're going to implant in the wall of the uterus and then kind of reach out and interact with the mother's material, and it allows them to create this direct line between the baby and the mother. And they're interacting in particular with a type of artery called the spiral artery, and they're able to reshape these arteries so that they have lower resistance, which means there's a better flow of material from the mother to the infant, and they're also no longer able to constrict and cut off flow from the mother to the infant, which means that the baby is getting basically as much as it wants, as long as it wants, and the mom can't, whether she's trying to or not, there's no way for her to just turn off that flow. It's just going to keep on going, and it allows the baby to get as much as it possibly can out of the mother. And this has three main consequences. So the first is that the baby's gaining access to all the stuff within the mother's arterial blood, and that's her own source of nutrients as well as the source of nutrients of the baby. So it's able to get as much energy from her as it needs, which means that she can end up feeling quite drained because it's taking all of the stuff that she might have used in her own body as well. And the mother can't alter the flow to her offspring without also altering the flow to herself, because it is this one single source. So all she can really do is just keep eating to keep both of them well fed. Another thing that happens is that this makes sure that the volume of blood reaching the placenta is mostly independent of control by the local maternal vasculature. So the mom can't regulate how much the fetus is getting, which means that it can, if it wants, take more than she would like to give. So she doesn't have any control over how much and when it's taking stuff. And finally, there's also a flow in the opposite direction. So not only is the mother able, whether she wants to or not, to give things to the fetus, but the fetus can also release its own things that can go through that blood into the mother. So we know, for example, that the placenta can release hormones, and those are the same hormones I was talking about earlier on that can be used as markers of pregnancy. So these things that it releases as it's developing. And all of these things can be released directly into the mother. And this allows the fetus to potentially release things that actually can manipulate the mother. So for example, human chorionic gonadotropin and also human placental lactogen do both of these things. So just to take the second one as an example, HPL, it acts on maternal prolactin receptors and increases maternal resistance to insulin. So if you've heard about gestational diabetes, well, this is where it comes from. So by increasing maternal resistance to insulin, the mother has to counter this in some way, or what happens is that she'll just always be maintaining higher blood glucose levels for really long periods after her meals. And of course that's quite useful to the placenta, to the baby via the placenta, because it's able to get all of that glucose, and that glucose is great for energy. So it wants to have all of that stuff, so it's promoting this. But we know that's quite bad for the female because it can result in gestational diabetes, which has a lot of bad implications for the mom. So what females have generally tended to do, and they've evolved to this response, is to increase insulin production. And that allows them to counter this. They can get rid of that glucose faster, and so they don't have that prolonged period of exposure. And so this shows you that the things that the baby wants and the things that the mom wants are not necessarily one and the same, and that if one of these wins out too much over the other, it can be quite harmful. And so evolutionarily, there has to be quite an amazing balance that's struck between the infant and the mom. And whenever that's kind of crossed, whenever something happens to that balance, things can go really wrong. So a lot of women do end up not only having gestational diabetes, but then going on to never be able to get rid of that and just having diabetes permanently. So you can see where this is actually a very costly thing, not just during a particular pregnancy, but even into life after that. So it's really amazing what a long-term impact pregnancy can have because of these evolutionary mechanisms. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Daughn Gibson with the Pisgee Nest. And I chose that song because the next thing I want to talk about is another thing you may have heard a little bit about, and that is nesting psychology. And it's quite an interesting thing because you kind of hear about it colloquially, but there has also been some scientific research into this. And the fact that, you know, we tend to see lots of animals that will go out and they'll construct nests, or they'll kind of hunker down in a nice nested-in area. If you've ever had a cat, for example, that has become pregnant, then you'll notice that they kind of start to wander around and look for places where they can feel safe and go hide away in there and have their offspring. I had this happen with a cat of mine, and it was the first sign that we had that she had become pregnant. Well, human women also do this. And for the longest time, people kind of thought, well, it doesn't really happen in humans. There's just some kind of weird hormonal thing that makes women have a little burst of energy and then they happen to clean, or whatever the case might be. But as time has gone on, people have done more and more research into this and found that this is actually a significant pattern, and it is very much like the sort of pattern that we see in other animals. So this really does tend to be this evolutionary thing that we all kind of share. And so some researchers recently were interested in looking at this a bit more scientifically and thinking about what exactly is this psychology, how does it manifest itself, how does that change over time. And just to give you a little bit of evolutionary background, the whole reason that nesting activities seem to kind of have evolved is that both during and after delivery, both mothers and their offspring tend to be very vulnerable. And that's to things like weather, things like predators, also pathogens. And so it's quite important for a pregnant female to find a good spot to go have her young where she can be sure that all of them will be safe during that process, during those first few hours, especially when everyone is tired and vulnerable and they need to be protected. And one adaptation, of course, that's really good for this is to find or prepare or hide in a very safe place. And that often will be kind of a den, or it might be a hole in the ground, a cave, a nice big patch of grass that's quite thick, and you can kind of, nest in a little bit, and you kind of dampen it down so you've got one little flat bit and the rest of it falls over you and keeps you nice and covered. There are lots of different formats that these areas take. And another thing that's quite nice about this, not only is it kind of environmentally sheltering you, but it also makes sure that the mother and her offspring are quite close and they're all together, and it allows them to have the chance to kind of smell each other and see each other and hear each other and develop these really important bonds and attachment signals with each other that are very important for allowing them to find each other later and recognize each other, and to help the mother get certain surges of hormones that ensure that she'll continue taking care of the young later on. In humans, there's been some work that's found that this kind of early interaction with the young in a safe place can reduce stress and also help the mother kind of manage intense emotions, especially those associated with later on postpartum depression. It can also be really useful for facilitating social play and enhancing development of language. So really fundamental stuff that will kind of set the trajectory of how development will happen later on. It all starts quite early in this post-delivery stage. So it's really important to have the right setting in which to do all of this. And as I said, we've seen this nesting behavior in lots of animals, and we know that it's quite normal. We understand why they do it. But in humans, we tend to think of it as this kind of just crazy, psychotic state that a woman gets in because she just feels like she has to clean. and she wants to tidy everything, and she just becomes really crazy about making the house look really perfect, and it's often kind of a joke. And sometimes it's even regarded as being quite dangerous because people say, well, these women are doing all this activity, they're lifting things and reaching up and cleaning things that are really high up, and all of this could be quite dangerous because she needs to be resting, she needs to be relaxing. And really the researchers of this study, they wanted to say, well, is that really the case? Is it out of control? Is it dangerous? Or is it perfectly natural and actually quite healthy? Because, of course, if these behaviors are all adaptive in wild animals, there's no reason to think they wouldn't also be adaptive in humans and actually serve a very important function in the whole birthing process. So what these recent researchers were doing was looking in particular at two major nesting behaviors. And one of them was space preparation, and the other was social selectivity. And they defined space preparation as an activity that kind of includes not just nest building, so the physical act of having a little bed, if you like, to lie in, but also kind of selecting and manipulating an appropriate birth site. So in humans, you might think this means getting a nursery ready, or staying close to home in general, maybe going out and buying the supplies you think you might need once the baby is born. All these sorts of things that are just kind of associated with setting up that area that you want to be in, either to give birth or to be with the baby right after birth has occurred. And then social selectivity is kind of an interesting one because you might not think of this when you think of human women kind of reaching the end of their pregnancy. But this is the idea that they're determining who's going to be permitted into the birthing environment. And a lot of times out in the wild we see that mothers will prefer complete solitude. So I mentioned my cat earlier, and she's a great example of that. She really just wanted to be away from everyone, and that was one of the big advantages of the kind of birthing area that she had found, was that we had no idea where it was, and she would just kind of go hide away in there and be by herself. Well, in social animals, you don't always see that being the case, because you often have people being there to help you prepare for this. And in humans, you need to have someone to help you deliver. Often you've got these complications where you have to maybe turn the baby around, or have water to clean things up, or all sorts of things that you might need some help with. And so actually in more social organisms, you might be selecting those people that you trust, that you feel are clean and safe and knowledgeable. And of course some of these decisions might be very conscious, others might be much more subconscious. You might also simply find that this is manifesting as just not wanting to be around strangers, not wanting to be around people that you don't trust all that well or have absolutely never met before. And so all of this, of course, ultimately is going to be quite useful for protecting infants from infanticide, which we might not expect that, but kind of just on an evolutionary timescale that might have been a problem for human precursors and ancestors in the past. It also, as I mentioned earlier, is quite good for immediate identification and bonding between the mother and her offspring, because you don't want to have people around you that might whisk off your baby and then have that bond be between the baby and another person. You also want to decrease the risk of infectious disease transmission. This is going to be particularly important, again, in social species where you might have a lot of individuals around you that could accidentally transmit something to your young. So all of this is going to be really important in kind of getting ready for that final delivery of the baby. And the researchers examined women in different stages of pregnancy, and they were able to see how nesting behaviors varied as a function of reproductive status. So they compared women in the three different trimesters, but then they also were able, as in that earlier study, they also were able to look at certain women as they went through the whole pregnancy and see how they changed from one phase to the next, to see if there was a particular time when there was a peak in all of these behaviors. And indeed what they found was that there was kind of a gradual development of nesting behaviors that peaked in the third trimester. So it was really just before the baby arrived that women were particularly interested in preparing their space. And women, of course, at that time are quite tired because the baby is getting very heavy, they're getting very sore. There's a lot of energy going into that last big burst of growth in the young, and so women don't always have energy to do this. And what the researchers found was that they tended to have bursts. So they would have periods of downtime when they were quite tired, and then this would be followed by a period of lots of energy. And when they had that energy, the women remarkably, a lot of them, consistently said they always felt the urge to put that energy into preparing the space. They also, all of them expressed an interest in being around people that they knew, in particular their family and their close friends, also being in familiar places, so they wanted to stay close to home, and they were quite averse to any sort of novelty. They didn't want to do anything that they hadn't done before. They wanted to stick with what they knew and felt comfortable with. And some of the nesting behaviors in particular that they talked about were things like getting rid of unwanted items, so getting all the trash out of the house, only having in there the things you actually need for the baby, going shopping and picking up things that they needed for the baby, so maybe having a rocking chair or diapers and bottles and that sort of, those basic supplies. And what they thought was quite interesting, the researchers, was that the women expressed less of an emphasis on kind of cleaning behaviors associated with pathogens and more that was just kind of like organizing stuff. And they think that this is maybe because early on in the pregnancy, again, we're talking evolutionarily here, so this might not be something that the women themselves are thinking about actively, but early on in the pregnancy, infants are really susceptible to infections, and that's when you can have a lot of damage if the women themselves become infected and can accidentally pass that on to their offspring. And so the researchers suggested that actually by the time that the women have this big peak in nesting behaviors at that last trimester, maybe that the anti-pathogen stuff is no longer quite as important because the babies have kind of passed the critical period. They're into a stage where they're probably going to be all right, and so the women don't have to worry so much about cleaning the environment of those sorts of things. Now this might not be the case at all, but this is a potential thing that they might want to investigate in the future. And all in all, the patterns that they found here were quite consistent with the ideas that nesting behaviors in humans do have an adaptive purpose. They aren't just some crazy side effect of the hormones that has nothing to do with the survival of the young, because they think that actually all of these sorts of things probably helped women have more successful births over time. And so it's been an evolutionary thing where the women that felt compelled to do this sort of stuff were the ones that had more successful births. They had healthier offspring, better bonds, whatever the case might be. And this was then something that was perpetuated maybe through our genes or through what we've learned from others. It could be both social and genetic. And then this is why we see ourselves doing this more and more even today. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Gnarls Barkley with Surprise. And that brings us to the last little bit of today's show. And this is kind of a fun and less scientifically serious bit about surprising facts that have to do with pregnancy. And I've taken a lot of these from a lay article that I found online on a reputable pregnancy site. And I thought that this was all quite interesting because a lot of these facts I'm about to go through are things that we think we know about pregnancy, and actually a lot of the information that we've had that we kind of consider common sense isn't necessarily what's actually the truth. And so I thought this is a good thing to kind of highlight all these misconceptions and set a few of them straight. So the first one up is the relationship between stress and fetal health. And this one is of note because a lot of people tend to think that the more stressed out a mother is, the more likely it's going to harm her young in some way. And people tend to think that if you're really stressed out, your baby's not going to be sleeping well, or it's not going to be getting enough nutrition, or it might become sick. But actually, a recent study found that higher stress and anxiety levels led to a lot of positive things in newborns. So newborns that had mothers that were more stressed out tended to have faster auditory nerve signals, which is a sign of better neurological development. So this suggests that potentially some amount of stress might actually be beneficial in some way by triggering something to happen in the developing young. Now, it might not be actually the stress itself so much as the behaviors that a mother performs when she's feeling stressed, but the point is that there's something about that stressful situation that actually, far from having this negative effect that we expect, might actually have a beneficial effect on the young. The next one on the list is movement in utero. And this one's kind of interesting because I did talk a little bit about this a couple weeks ago when I did my first show, and I did mention that babies will have a lot of movements before mothers can even feel them. And this is very much kind of in that theme. And it turns out that fetuses not only move quite a lot, but they actually move at least once per minute on average. So there's a ton of movement going on there. And this is much, much more than most mothers are ever going to know or feel about. You know, even in that period when they are able to feel the baby moving, there's much more going on than they even realize. And the sorts of movements that the babies are engaging in are things like yawning and swallowing. They have little breathing motions, although of course they're not actually breathing in any sort of air or anything. They have thumb sucking behaviors. They kind of play with their own body parts. They make facial expressions. And all of these are the same sorts of things. They look exactly the same in utero as they are once the baby is actually born. And the reason that this is quite interesting is that for a very long time, researchers thought that babies that were in the womb were kind of one entity, and then the whole birthing process was a really transformative event that changed everything and caused the baby to start doing a whole bunch of new stuff. And actually, the more that they see these images coming out of the mother's womb using ultrasound, they're able to find out that actually maybe birth is not as transformative an event as we thought, and that babies have been doing this sort of stuff all along, and actually it's just now they're doing it out in the air instead of within the mother. The next fact, number 3, has to do with the baby's sex. And this is kind of a fun one because I've got some friends right now who are pregnant, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, and everyone is always, you know, the first thing you find out, once your friend is pregnant is you're always asking them, do you know the sex of the baby yet? Are you going to find out what the sex of the baby is? And there's always kind of a pool who's going to guess about whether it's a male or female. And lots of people think that they've got the foolproof method to decide whether a baby is a male or female. So sometimes people think that it has to do with what the mom is eating, so whether she's craving one thing rather than another, or the shape of the belly, or how high up the belly is, all these sorts of things. Some people have even suggested that when the mother becomes pregnant, so kind of when throughout the menstrual cycle she becomes pregnant. Some have also said that you can look at the mother's heart rate and decide from that whether the baby is going to be a male or a female. So there are all these things out there, but actually it looks like none of this can reliably be used to predict a baby's gender. So people have tried to correlate all of these things, and they've not found any association in any consistent sort of way. However, one thing they have found very, very recently is that there are some signs that changes in the mother are associated with the gender of the baby. So maybe we're looking at the wrong sorts of things. It's not just the kind of the belly, but sorts of characteristics that the mother displays. So for example, mothers of boys tend to have worse memories during pregnancy. And another pattern that they mentioned in this article was that mothers of boys were more likely to develop an autoimmune disease. And both of these things are potentially because of the fact that boy babies have a Y chromosome, of course. Females have 2 X's, boys are X and Y. And we know that the mother is going to be an XX, and so this Y chromosome is quite a different thing. Not only has the mom now got some of the father's DNA in there, she's got this weird Y chromosome, she's got bits of the baby's genetic material within her body that will end up being there for the rest of her life, and so she's got all these new things within her body that can completely change how her system works if there are these encounters between her own stuff and the baby's genetic stuff. So potentially these kind of really low-level microbiological sorts of things could have an impact on the mom, and those sorts of signals could be used to predict whether a mother is pregnant with a female or a male. Now another interesting thing that maybe actually I should have put earlier on when I was talking about what's happening with all the baby's movements is associated with in utero crying. And this one sounds like it's kind of sad, but I promise it's not. Researchers have recently been able to use ultrasound imaging in order to look at what babies are doing within the uterus in terms of breathing in and making little motions of their mouths and their noses. And it looks very much like they're crying while they're in the uterus, because you can see the amniotic fluid kind of moving in and around the mouths and noses, and all this is very similar to the sorts of flow of air that we would see if these babies were on the outside and crying in the air. And we can also see similar patterns of breathing and diaphragm contractions, and all of this cumulatively suggests that the babies are basically crying while they're in the womb. And this is all quite weird, of course, because, why are you crying when you can't actually communicate? Because, of course, crying is to, alert the parent that you need something, that you want something, and if the parent can't respond to that, then it seems kind of like a strange thing that the baby would even be doing this at this point. But what's interesting about this is that researchers think that this doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to communicate yet. It may in fact be kind of practicing for later on communication. But it seems like it could maybe just be a state of being where babies just kind of have different things that they do, and crying happens to be one of them, and it doesn't always mean anything. So sometimes they have what researchers call quiet wakefulness, other times they have active wakefulness, sometimes they have deep sleep, other times they have dream sleep. And then one other thing that they happen to do is crying, and it's just like any of these other things, there's quite a lot of variation, and sometimes there's meaning to it, and sometimes there isn't. But either way, it seems that they're doing it way before they're even born. They're doing it while they're still within the mothers. The next interesting fact on the list is about caffeine. This is probably one you've heard quite a lot, and this is the idea that caffeine is a terrible thing for unborn babies. Mothers shouldn't be having Coke or coffee or anything like that. And it turns out that actually coffee or caffeine is not necessarily that bad. And scientists have found that about 200 milligrams of caffeine, which equates to 2 8-ounce cups of coffee, is perfectly safe. And actually even more than this might also be fine. And the reason they think that people have typically avoided this is that in the past there were these studies that found that women who drank really large amounts of caffeine a day tended to have more miscarriages. But this was a correlation. There was no causation actually found there, and the amount of caffeine ingested was really enormous and kind of very unlikely in terms of normal consumption. And so they're saying basically now, if you have kind of average consumption of caffeine, it's probably going to be all right to continue that on into your pregnancy. And one of the things that they think potentially is a link between this whole kind of caffeine and miscarriage fallacy is that women who are at lower risk of miscarriages are the same women that tend to have more nausea earlier on in their pregnancy. And these are just, this completely has nothing to do with caffeine. But the thing is that women who have more nausea early on also tend to not be able to stomach coffee. It's just too much for them to drink because they are too nauseous. And so what you tend to find then is that women who aren't drinking coffee are the same women who are not likely to have a miscarriage. And so there seems to be this relationship that really isn't there. Because you then conversely have the women who can stomach coffee because they aren't nauseous, are drinking it, but already have had something else going on that predisposes them to having a miscarriage. And it just happens that they're also the ones who are able to drink coffee. So it seems like maybe that was just a chance correlation there that's not really founded in any kind of biological relationship. Although, of course, they will continue to look into this and try to get a bit more specific if they can, because it would be really good to know, is there a threshold over which you shouldn't be consuming anymore? Is there maybe an effect of coffee and caffeine in general? Or, is this all just kind of a fallacy? And they don't know 100% for sure yet, but it does look like it's quite all right to have at least a couple of cups a day if you want. And kind of on that same note, I guess, on the whole relationship between pregnancy and things you're ingesting, is a lot of people think that there are some techniques that can help you induce labor, and a lot of these do have to do with food. So having certain types of tea or certain types of oils, eating spicy food. Another one that's not food related is the idea that you can have sex in order to stimulate pregnancy, having the baby. But actually there's no evidence that any of these things works. And a lot of people are quite desperate at the very end to hurry up and have that baby because they've had it in there for so long and they just want to meet it, and they're sick of having this enormous stomach. But none of those things actually seems to be a reliable way of jump-starting the delivery. However, there is one kind of natural thing that is highly unlikely for you to ever want to do, but they have found that nipple stimulation will kind of induce the delivery. Unfortunately, you need a ridiculous amount of this, so something like 3 hours a day, and that will release all of the hormones that are required to tell your body that, hey, it's time for you to be having that baby. Because here I have all this preparedness up here and these mammary glands to feed this baby, so you better get it out there. But I don't think that that is a solution that too many people are going to want to pursue, because that sounds very uncomfortable. Now the final thing here on the list is fetal responses to mother's stress and relaxation states. So this is quite a nice one actually, because this research has found that, especially in the third trimester, so you've got babies that are basically fully formed, ready to go, they're just kind of getting bigger at this state. So they are quite, very human-like at this point. And they are quickly responding when mothers are doing one task versus another. And there are things like changes in heart rates, changes in movements, changes in behaviors. And there's also the reverse pattern that's seen. So moms can feel a difference when their babies change behavior. And even if they're not feeling a movement, they'll kind of have some sort of a physiological connection via the nerve system, so that mothers and infants are kind of subtly releasing these cues to each other so that they're really tied into each other. And researchers still aren't exactly sure what is happening to facilitate this, because it is, kind of a seemingly invisible thing, but it probably does have a lot to do with that connection, that bloodstream connection between the mom and the infant. And of course, the infant, for its part, can hear quite a lot of what's going on and even perceive some light, so those sorts of cues might also make a difference. And all of it does seem to promote a really immediate response between a mother and a child. And, people often talk about these kind of bonds and connections between parents and their young, and these things really are very genetically, hormonally driven. So there are actual noticeable changes that happen when people become parents. They become very sensitive to their offspring. They can hear things from miles away. They wake up in the middle of the night completely awake and ready to go help. And it looks like maybe some of these changes begin to happen before the baby is even born. So you've got these kind of connections forming very early on that allow the parent, especially the mother, to respond almost immediately whenever the baby needs anything. And that is quite a nice, kind of pleasant thought to end the show on. So that is the second part of the pregnancy series. So now I hope you know everything you wanted to know about what it's like to be pregnant. I have a little extra content I didn't get a chance to get through today, so I will put that on the website in case you're interested in reading a little bit more. And everything else about the show will also be on there in case you want to look up the songs that I played or find some further reading to do. And that is all for me, and I will talk to you next week.